What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review Paul Thomas Anderson's One Battle After Another, which goes into wide release tomorrow. I caught it tonight up at the AMC Lincoln Square in IMAX 70mm, and if you're planning on seeing the movie, I recommend seeing it on the biggest screen that you can possibly find. But let's just dive right in. This is an explosive movie in terms of both spectacle as well as subject matter, with Leonardo DiCaprio starring as an ex-revolutionary slash domestic terrorist who's basically been in hiding for years trying to raise his daughter as best he can. But all hell breaks loose when his old adversary, in the form of Sean Penn, who totally steals the movie, comes looking for him, leading to a series of just crazy shootouts and riots in the streets and car chases and copious amounts of deranged humor, basically any kind of insanity that you can think of. And this is basically PTA holding up a warped mirror to our society today and giving us an insane adventure story, unlike anything you've seen in recent years, on the broadest canvas that Paul Thomas Anderson has ever worked with. And this is the kind of mad, ambitious project that a filmmaker can only attempt after building up decades of goodwill amongst moviegoers, because Paul Thomas Anderson, as much as I love him, he's never generated a big box office, and the budget of this movie was huge. But he's going to need all the goodwill he can find this weekend, because this movie leans heavily into several volatile political issues, and as we all know, people these days love to remain perfectly calm and rational when discussing movies that lean into politics in any way, shape, or form. Personally, I avoid politics like the plague on this channel, and I trust people to do their own homework and form their own opinions. But when one of the best directors of the last few decades decides to make a political movie, well, then I have no choice but to dive in as well. But I promise I will keep all my political grandstanding on my part to an absolute minimum, and I'll focus instead on the movie, where we've got plenty to sink our teeth into. So in any case, this is obviously one of those movies where no matter what I say, I'm going to piss off somebody, so we're just going to grip it and rip it, as they say, and just dive right in. So let's start with some of the easy stuff. In spite of the fact that this movie is 2 hours and 41 minutes long, it moves. It moves along at a very brisk pace. I can't remember the last time I saw a movie that's this long, but this fast. And mostly that's because from the very first frame of film to the very last frame of film, Paul Thomas Anderson is just showing you some of the craziest shit you've ever seen. And speaking of film, if you can find it on film, I recommend it, because he shot it in the VistaVision format. And the VistaVision format was very popular back in the 1950s with movies like The Searchers, one of the best westerns ever made. And I'm not enough of a technician to explain the differences between VistaVision as a film format versus some of the other 70mm formats out there. But as Paul Thomas Anderson claims in this clip, it's just better.
VistaVision was a format that was invented to try to figure out how to use more of a larger portion of the 35mm camera negative. So in other words, bigger is better.
But it's not just the format of the film which gives it this sense of incredible spectacle. There's some chase sequences, there's some action sequences, and I want to be very vague in how I describe these, but also the good news is I don't have the technical expertise to describe how he's doing it. But let's just say there's a chase scene later in the movie where you'll be like, whoa, how the fuck did he do this? How did he shoot this? How did he achieve these effects? And Paul Thomas Anderson, obviously, he's an expert craftsman. He's been blowing our minds with filmmaking technique since the mid-90s. And I was a junior in college when Boogie Nights came out, and it just rocked our world. We were playing the soundtrack at parties and watching the movie on repeat. I've been a fan of Paul Thomas Anderson for a long time, and I'm a huge fan of a lot of his movies. I love Hard Eight. I love There Will Be Blood. I'm a big fan of the work that Joaquin Phoenix and Philip Seymour Hoffman did in The Master. So suffice to say, he's got a lot of goodwill and credit in the bank with me as far as whatever he wants to do is concerned. Which is why I had no trouble in advance trusting Paul Thomas Anderson to tackle this kind of subject matter in an interesting way. And just to put my cards on the table, I have absolutely no romantic notions about blowing up buildings, because 55 years ago, the Weather Underground blew up a building a few doors down from where I live here in New York. I live on West 11th Street between 5th and 6th Ave, and anytime I walk out the front of my building and head east, I see this disgusting early 70s architecture marking the spot where some members of the Weather Underground blew themselves up back in 1970. Look it up on Wikipedia if you want to find all the gory details. So I pretty much get a daily reminder of just how dangerous domestic terrorists can be. And suffice to say, I will not be dressing up as a member of the French 75 for Halloween this year, but I can still get on the wavelength of a movie like this if I feel like the director is trying to dig into these characters in a way that feels honest and humane and true. And I should warn everyone out there that over the next couple of days, there are going to be a lot of really obnoxious people saying a lot of really obnoxious things about this movie from a left, right, or center point of view. And there are going to be a lot of people offering oversimplified interpretations of both the heroes and the villains featured at the heart of the story. But for viewers who are paying attention, you'll see that Paul Thomas Anderson, he's not creating propaganda with this movie. He includes all sorts of fucked up little details about these characters, which leads to plenty of confusion and acrimony between those members of the French 75 who are still active at the time of this movie versus those who have kind of aged out of it and just want to drink their booze and smoke their weed in peace and basically not be hunted by the man anymore. Speaking of the man, I'm going to keep coming back to this, but Sean Penn, he completely and totally takes over this movie. He hasn't been this good in a long time. And obviously when it comes to politics, we all know where Sean Penn stands. But what's great about his handling of this character, who's trying to hunt down all the members of the French 75, is that he includes so much fucking humor. And it's dark humor, and it's subversive humor, and it's really disturbing humor, but it is humor nonetheless. And the crowd in my theater was just losing their minds. Pretty much anytime he said anything, but every once in a while he'll have these just one-liners out of left field where you're like, that is the weirdest thing I've ever fucking heard, but I love you for it. And getting back to this idea of depicting revolutionaries in a humane way, it reminds me of one of the movies on this list of films that Paul Thomas Anderson put out there that served either as inspiration for this movie or just movies that are kind of loosely connected to the drama unfolding in one battle after another. And shout out to my friend Ronald Meyer, who showed this list to me. But one of the movies on this list is Sidney Lumet's film Running on Empty from the late 80s. And in Running on Empty, the movie's about River Phoenix, whose parents, once upon a time, were domestic terrorists, but they've basically been in hiding or on the run ever since. And meanwhile, River Phoenix, he's a teenage boy. He's trying to fall in love and learn how to get good at like playing like the piano and just trying to get into college and all the things that teenage boys are concerned with. But because of all the past deeds of his parents, his life basically is in a state of total chaos as they move from one town to another. But in that movie, Sidney Lumet explores the lives of these retired revolutionaries in a really interesting way. And I can totally see how that movie would inspire Paul Thomas Anderson's approach to One Battle After Another. But the other movies on the list were Martin Brest's buddy comedy Midnight Run, William Friedkin's The French Connection, which has one of the all-time great car chases. Don't watch it on any streaming service now because Disney has censored the movie ever since they bought Fox. But if you find an older version, back when Fox still had autonomy, that's the version of The French Connection you want to see. There's also The Battle of Algiers, which I only saw once on DVD years ago, but that's a pretty politically volatile movie as well, and you can definitely see how it ties into a lot of the characters in One Battle After Another. And the last one on the list, John Ford's Western, The Searchers, which is probably the best example of how to put VistaVision to use in creating a big epic saga. And it has some overlap with One Battle After Another in terms of the plot, because in that movie, John Wayne is looking for his niece who's been kidnapped by the Comanche. But now let's talk a little bit about Leonardo DiCaprio and his performance as Bob in this movie, because anytime Sean Penn is not on the screen, Leonardo DiCaprio absolutely steals the show. He's fucking hysterical in this movie because while once upon a time he was totally invested in making bombs and rockets and doing all sorts of crazy destructive shit, and you almost get the sense that he was less interested in politics and much more interested in just the sexual appeal of the character of Perfidia, played by Teyana Taylor. And I get it. In this movie, Paul Thomas Anderson leans into the TNA. There's not really any nudity in this movie, but there are a lot of lingering, loving close-ups of different parts of her anatomy and her body. For guys who like strong women with like good builds and like awesome thighs and ass and that sort of thing, you're gonna have a lot of fun with this movie. But Leonardo DiCaprio's character Bob, he and Perfidia, their chemistry on screen or their mutual desire is absolutely 100% undeniable, even if as they get older and get into building a family, they start to drift apart and have very different ideas about how they want to live their lives. But this is definitely the funniest Leonardo DiCaprio's been since The Wolf of Wall Street. And in that movie, he had all these great scenes, like when he's all fucked up on Quaaludes and he's trying to drag himself out to the car, and you have all that great physical comedy. But what's great about the character of Bob is that he's killed so many brain cells with drugs and alcohol since his days as a revolutionary. He can't quite remember like all the phrases and the code words and the lingo that this terrorist organization uses to communicate and keep in contact and talk about rendezvous points and all that kind of stuff. And you're seeing Leo just like trying to fight through the fog of like 15 years of forgotten memories and that sort of thing. And he's just getting pissed off and he's getting enraged. And throughout all the scenes where he's just pulling out his hair in frustration, he just had my audience absolutely howling from start to finish.
I don't remember that part. All right, let's just not nitpick over the passwords.
And also, I got to give credit where credit is due, because while Leo is known for being one of the world's most beautiful men with those elf-like features, in this movie, he just lets himself go. It's a little bit like Jeff Bridges in The Big Lebowski, where he kind of lets his waistline go, and the facial hair is all out of whack, and the wardrobe is a total mess. And I think it takes a lot of courage for somebody who's known as like a sexual icon to allow himself to be depicted in such a physically unattractive way. But in spite of all of his baggy clothes and his greasy hair and all of his wrinkles and that sort of thing, if you squint, you can still see the beautiful man beneath the exterior of Bob. But what's also interesting is seeing how, while Bob is like, I mean, in terms of like political extremes, he's as extreme as one person can get, because he quite literally was blowing shit up for all of his political objectives. But it's interesting seeing the generational divide between him and his daughter, because he's trying real hard to engage with her and like kind of be on her wavelength and speak her language.
Oh, they're just my friends.
Now, is that a he or a she or a they?
It's not that hard. They, them.
Okay, I just want to be polite.
But the youth of today, let's just say he finds them to be a little bit bewildering, and he also finds them to be kind of incompetent and disorganized, confused, and that sort of thing. So it's interesting seeing how, and who knows, maybe this is something from Paul Thomas Anderson's own life, but I feel like even though you might be on like the far left of things, depending upon your age, you might have a very different point of view on particular topics from somebody who might be like in their late teens. Speaking of Bob's daughter Willa, actress Chase Infinity, she's got some chops, and I feel like she's one of those rare actresses these days who realizes that sometimes you don't need dialogue to make her a major impression. She's a very physical actress, whether she's drilling karate at the dojo where Benicio del Toro is everybody's sensei, or if she's learning how to fire machine guns, or if she's cuffed in the back of a car like kicking the window, whether she's into like martial arts or dancing or whatever the case might be, she's not afraid to get physical. And this is one of those movies where it requires everybody to be physical, even if they're not young enough to do the physical stuff. And let's just be honest, Leonardo DiCaprio is no longer the young man that we saw in Romeo and Juliet or Titanic back in the late 90s. He's a pretty heavy-set, middle-aged dude these days, and that's part of the comedy of the movie. It's just seeing him like trying and failing to keep up with all these young revolutionaries, like running on rooftops or getting in high-speed car chases. Just everything he does, or just crawling along the floor of the dojo that's run by Benicio del Toro. All that stuff's absolutely hysterical. But Benicio del Toro, he's pretty goddamn funny in this movie as well. He's not as funny as Sean Penn, but he has some great scenes where basically he and Leonardo DiCaprio are driving around looking for his daughter and just having a few beers and reminiscing about the past and what it's going to take to have, like, you know, basically to face the present moment with clear eyes and a sense of courage and that sort of thing. So Benicio del Toro is firing on all cylinders. Regina Hall is good in this as well. Alana Hayam from Licorice Pizza, she makes an appearance in here. But as far as some of my criticisms and reservations about this movie are concerned, there are a few scenes where Paul Thomas Anderson gets right up to the edge of being a little bit dogmatic and heavy-handed in terms of whatever message might be lying at the core of this movie. And the message is mixed up and it's confused because the movie's so chaotic and it's so deranged and it's going in so many different directions at once. It's hard to say, oh, this movie is arguing for this, but if you're paying attention, you'll see. You can kind of get a general idea of where Paul Thomas Anderson's political loyalties might lie. But some of the adversaries in this movie, like kind of the powers that be behind the character of Sean Penn, that's probably where he is at his, most clumsy or most obvious in terms of his depiction of those characters. But at the same time, some of those scenes are so fucking weird and so funny and so off-putting. You're like, what world are we living in, and who are these people, and where did they come from? So even when the movie starts to feel a little bit more like it's trying to kind of beat you over the head with a sledgehammer, Paul Thomas Anderson always finds a way to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat by just injecting some much-needed humor into this movie. And in the absence of all that humor, this movie probably would have been completely and totally insufferable and unendurable. And I suspect that a lot of that humor comes from author Thomas Pynchon. And as we all know, Paul Thomas Anderson's a massive fan of Thomas Pynchon. He previously adapted one of his books when he made Inherent Vice back in 2014. And while this movie is not a strict adaptation of any one book by Thomas Pynchon, I'm seeing here that Thomas Pynchon's novel Vineland from 1990 was originally kind of like the seed of the idea, and Paul Thomas Anderson was thinking about doing a direct adaptation, but instead of adapting the novel, Paul Thomas Anderson decided to write a series of kind of interlocking separate storylines that would take a few ingredients from Vineland without being a direct adaptation. But let's see, is he credited on IMDb as being one of the writers? Yeah, the movie's credited to both Paul Thomas Anderson as well as Thomas Pynchon, so he must have felt indebted to him enough where he felt like he deserved to give him credit. But I have to confess, I'm nearly a total blank slate slate when it comes to Thomas Pynchon. I read the book The Crying of Lot 49 back in college in an English class, and that was a long time ago. And much like Leonardo DiCaprio's character in this movie, I've killed a few brain cells since then. So I remember the cover of the book, and I think I've still got it in my collection somewhere. But it's been a long time since I've read any Thomas Pynchon. But getting back to the ingredients in this movie that I dislike, I don't really have any major complaints about the movie. I think most of my complaints are going to come from how people respond to the movie or how they write about the movie. I've been very willfully and deliberately avoiding any reviews of any kind because obviously anytime you give critics an opportunity to write about politics, they'll kind of take the ball and run with it into just total oblivion to the point where you don't even want to see the movie anymore. It's like, you know what? Just trust Paul Thomas Anderson. You love his movies, you love his career, and obviously he's got peaks and valleys and ups and downs, and some movies that you like more than others, but at this point he's earned your trust. And I would assume that anybody out there who's excited about this movie, I would just recommend ignore me, ignore the reviews, ignore the online discourse that's going to naturally unfold over the next couple of days, and just put your faith in Paul Thomas Anderson. If you've loved his work in the past, there's a very good chance that you're going to be blown away by one battle after another. I guess the big question now is, where do I rank it in his filmography? Because I think, because of just my age at the time, when I saw Boogie Nights, I was a junior in college, I think Boogie Nights will always be my favorite movie by him, or at least it'll be the movie that I've seen the greatest number of times.
I want you to go over there and sit on the couch with Eddie.
Here we go. Are we gonna fuck?
Oh, yes.
And There'll Be Blood is the movie that I admire the most and look up to the most, and I've seen that a couple times as well. I mean, I fucking love There'll Be Blood. I would place One Battle After Another right beside The Master. And perhaps that's just because in both The Master as well as in One Battle After Another, Paul Thomas Anderson had access to a ton of money and is telling his story with the biggest possible canvas that he possibly can. And in terms of the actual story, The Master and One Battle After Another have almost nothing to do with one another. But The Master is one of those movies where there are certain individual scenes that just blew my mind, but I don't necessarily like the movie overall the same way I do with like There'll Be Blood or Boogie Nights. And I feel like that's the way I'm going to remember One Battle After Another as well. I'm going to remember just howling with laughter at all the crazy shit that Sean Penn does in this movie, even if the movie overall doesn't necessarily want to make me want to go out and join like some revolutionary group and start blowing up buildings. That's just not that is not in my DNA whatsoever. But as a 2-hour, 40-minute roller coaster within the lives of those characters, yeah, I'm thankful that Paul Thomas Anderson gave me that opportunity. But the big question now is, what kind of reception is this movie going to get? Because I feel like at this point, critics have more or less made up their mind that they're all in lockstep, arms akimbo, joining forces to praise this movie, and they're going to be banging the drum for Oscars and Golden Globes and all that kind of stuff. But I looked at some early projections in terms of box office, and some people are saying that it'll probably open around like 20 or 25 million in North America and do about the same internationally, which is not necessarily the number that you're hoping for anytime you invest a ton of money into a movie. And I've seen some people saying it doesn't matter how much money this movie makes because all that matters is that Warner Brothers invested an enormous amount of money into making this kind of auteur-driven epic movie. But I feel like that attitude is a little bit childish and naive because I would like to see Warner Brothers and Disney and Paramount and all these studios. I would love to see every studio try to make one movie like this every year. And I'm not saying they need to make a movie like this in terms of like the subject matter or the politics, but a big, huge, original IMAX 70mm movie from one of our best directors that's not based on pre-existing IP, where you see a filmmaker breaking new ground, telling an original story in an exciting, vital, like dynamic, explosive way. Every studio should have the freedom to make one kind of movie like that in their overall slate every year. But the only way you're going to get to see that happen is if movies like this enjoy some box office return as well as some awards. So I hope that people will show up just because I want to see every single studio in the business around the world trying to go for it and make these big, prestigious movies. And here's another thing to consider. How will Quentin Tarantino react to this movie? Because for years, Quentin Tarantino and Paul Thomas Anderson have had a kind of a friendly rivalry, where in the 90s, obviously, Pulp Fiction and Boogie Nights came out within 2 or 3 years of each other, which put them both, it kind of put them on a collision course in terms of which filmmaker do you like more. And Pulp Fiction was much more successful than Boogie Nights in terms of box office, but you definitely had like your camps that were really kind of rooting for both. And then after Tarantino saw There'll Be Blood, it kind of fueled his jealousy that his rival was doing so well, and it forced him to kind of go back and kind of like re-examine his career, and that's when he made Inglourious Basterds. So I feel like A little envy and a little competitive spirit is always good when it comes to driving your competitors to greater heights. Like I feel like Denis Villeneuve and Christopher Nolan have a similar relationship where they respect each other and they admire each other, but I imagine they privately they're very much in competition with each other. And at this point, it's been 6 years since Tarantino's last movie, and I know he's written some books like Cinema Speculation, and he has this podcast. That doesn't cut it. Quentin Tarantino, I hope he'll give us one more big movie, and who knows, maybe one battle after another. We'll give him a not so subtle kick in the pants to get him off the sofa and back behind a movie camera where he belongs. In any case, I think that's about all I have to say about one battle after another. I think I managed to get through this video and discuss a couple different political topics without inserting my entire leg in my mouth on repeatedly, which is my greatest fear because I don't enjoy talking about politics on this channel whatsoever. As far as I'm concerned, if you fucking love movies and love film history, no matter what your politics might be, you're welcome to come hang on this channel and interact with the comments and talk about flicks until you're blue in the face. That is how I roll. That's how I've always rolled. So on that optimistic note about our political landscape, I'm going to wrap up this video, but I hope you enjoyed it to some degree. Please consider liking, subscribing, and hitting that notification bell. I would greatly appreciate it. And let me know down in the comments below what you think about one battle after another. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.